All right, hello and welcome everybody to our annual State of School Safety report and conversation. Some of you attended last year when we unpacked our findings. That was the first time we ever did an event around this annual report that we host at Safe and Sound Schools. And so this year, we thought we would keep the tradition going. So glad that so many of you could join us and unpack this year's findings. My name is Michelle Gay. I'm the Executive Director and co-founder of Safe and Sound Schools, and each year we try to assemble a multidisciplinary group of experts who I am joined with here this year. Very excited about the gang that's here with us today to unpack these findings and most importantly relate what we found in this study, this nationwide study, back to what you guys are seeing and experiencing in the field so that we can better prepare for a safe and sound school year this coming year. This past year, as you all expected, was going to be a challenge for all of us across the country. It doesn't matter if you were in a rural, suburban, urban community, wealthy, underserved. We knew that the COVID impacts were going to be deep this year again. We also were all very concerned, and we talked about it last year, about an uptick in violent behaviors that we were seeing already in our schools and communities. And you will see through our discussions here today and some of the findings that we have gathered in this annual report that those fears really did come to bear this year, probably no more prominently, no more deeply than the tragedy in Texas at Uvalde at Robb Elementary School. This survey, I want to point out, took place before that tragedy. So we have to keep that in mind in our conversations and weave in the relevance of these very significant events that have taken place after this data was collected. So before we go any further, I do want to introduce to you everybody who has joined me at the table here, and then we'll start digging into the data. I'll tell you a little bit more about the survey, who participated, and all that good stuff. So I'd like to start over here with Dr. John Nicoletti, Colorado's own. We had to take advantage of great talent here that's Colorado-based, and we just couldn't resist reaching out to Dr. John Nicoletti, who's done so much work here in this state, nationally and internationally. So Dr. John Nicoletti is a police and public safety psychologist, and he's a partner at Nicoletti Flater Associates. I'm going to give Dr. John a little time to talk about his background and what brings him to this work, and then we'll move on to Teresa. So welcome, John.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for inviting me. I'm a police psychologist and have contracts with a lot of law enforcement agencies here in Colorado, as well as federal agencies like NCIS and FBI. And the main area we work in at this point in time is threat assessment and trauma recovery. I'm part of a team at IACP that is designed to respond to mass casualty events to help first responders recover. Also do threat assessments for a lot of different places. And of note, for those of you in Colorado, we just received a fairly large grant from the Department of Homeland Security to provide training to K-12 school districts and college campuses involving targeted violence, radicalization, and mobilization. It's a 2-day intensive training, and it's paid for by Homeland Security. So if any of you are in Colorado and would be interested in that option, please feel free to contact me.
Excellent, thank you. On to Teresa Campbell. Many of you know Teresa. She is here often at NASRO and around the country, a lot of work in Colorado and internationally as well with Safer Schools Together, where she's the executive director. A lot of you know Teresa as the digital threat assessment lady. There's a lot to Teresa. I'm going to let her tell you a little bit more about her background and what brings her to this conversation.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me here. And most importantly, thank you to all of you for being here today and the work that you continue to do. I've been working in school safety for 30 years. I realize that ages me somewhat. And my work started not just in school safety, but also in behavioral threat assessment. Some of you may not be aware, but 8 days after Columbine, we had a school shooting in Canada. And we've had school shootings prior to that in Canada, but it was the first time that our government said, we need to do something. And a colleague of mine at the time started what's now known as the VITRA, Violence Threat Risk Assessment Model. It was working within that model And we started to notice a number of gaps early on, and the biggest gap being digital. So as recent as 7 to 8 years ago, we developed what's now called digital threat assessment training. And I think most people at this table would agree that it's really hard for us to conduct a behavioral threat assessment today without doing the digital threat assessment to look at the individual's digital behavioral baseline. We're working, unfortunately, on the tragedy that took place yesterday in Chicago, and I can tell you that report's about 37 pages long with multiple videos, with also plans around a school attack in addition to the parade attack. So wanting to take advantage of those different avenues that we can provide ways to access leakage to provide more comprehensive and accurate assessments of level of risk. In our offices, we have offices in Canada and the US. I'm very blessed to have an amazing team of threat analysts. They work 24/7 with many of our clients. We're trying to find people in advance that are on the pathway to violence, suicide, radicalization, and gang involvement. So we're trying to get ahead of some of these tragedies that we've seen of late. We also have an anonymous reporting tool, PSST, promoting safer schools together. So we're really a holistic organization that is trying to support each and every one of you.
Thank you. A few of you know this guy, Mo Kennedy. So I know it may be a better use of your 2 minutes, only 2 minutes, to talk a little bit about how we're tied together, the work that we do at Safe and Sound, your involvement in some of our projects, and our work with NASRO.
Absolutely, and I'm sure our attendees are already getting tired of hearing from me, and it is a little intimidating to be sitting with this group of experts, but we've had a great relationship with Michelle and Safe and Sound Schools for a number of years. Michelle is a very good friend of ours, and we can talk about ourselves in terms of what we think about the job that we do, and we know that's important. We know how we do the job. One of the things, and this is a big part of my job, is advocating for you and the job that you do across the country and certainly in Washington, D.C. And having partners like Michelle and Safe and Sound Schools only enhances that, because now it's coming from the parent perspective. And as you're going to hear today, not only from the parent perspective, but also from some hardcore data. We have argued, and I think we're on the absolute right side of this argument, that some of the data we see out there regarding SROs is so skewed. And the problem is we have an issue of some groups looking at data that's looking at arrests in schools, period, not applying it necessarily to SROs. And it really skews everything. We know that we don't arrest a lot of kids. And so anyway, sorry, I got on a soapbox.
No,
there,
it's
but
perfect.
It's the importance of our relationship.
It's perfect because it really tees up part of the conversation today. Year over year, we've been doing this study nationally. I'll tell you a little bit about who participated this year, but it's always multidisciplinary, from students all the way through superintendents, SROs, public safety professionals, mental health professionals, experts in the field. We, year over year, see that the data for SROs is consistent, and it is often very different than what you might be hearing in the media narrative. So there's some exciting stuff that came out this year, and we'll dig into that, just a little bit of a teaser, before heading to Dr. Melissa Reeves, who has been a longtime partner of ours at Safe and Sound Schools. It's such an honor to continue to invite Melissa to these roundtable conversations. It would take too long, really, to go through all the hats that she wears, all of the different organizations that she supports. So I'll give you the cliff notes. She's past president of the National Association of School Psychologists. She's a senior advisor to Safe and Sound Schools, of course, and she's a senior consultant at the Sigma Threat Management Associates organization. So longtime proponent and champion for SROs as well. So really wonderful to have you here with us, Melissa.
Thank you. Some of you are probably wondering, I started off as a special education teacher, then became a licensed professional counselor, and then spent many years actually working for the Cherry Creek School District as a school psychologist and a district coordinator of social, emotional, and behavioral services early on in my career. And really how I ended up getting into school safety was myself and a couple colleagues were called upon when Columbine happened to respond to Columbine. And we had no idea what we were doing. We didn't have training, we didn't have a skill set. I had all these letters behind my name. I acted like I knew what I was doing, but that's really what put my career path on the trajectory of school safety, was how do we prevent these things from happening in the first place, and what are those indicators we can look for? So I had actually moved to North Carolina for the past 15 years, just moved back to Colorado at the end of last summer, and I'm so happy to be back where I call home. And in the span of that time frame, I'm actually one of the lead authors of the National Association of School Psychologists Prepare School Crisis Prevention and Intervention Curriculum, where we have trained nationally and internationally multidisciplinary school crisis teams, for which SROs are critical members of those teams, in how do we prevent these kinds of things from happening in the first place, and how do we link it to all those other safe school initiatives that we're already doing. But then the behavioral and suicide threat assessment, how do we identify those indicators that tell us that someone might be on the pathway to violence or self-harm? And then also the curriculum specifically trains school mental health professionals and community mental health professionals on how do we respond using a multi-tiered approach when an incident happens, whether it's a large-scale school shooting, car accident, bus accident, death by suicide. And so I'm just honored to be here and be part of this group and to bring all those years of experience to the table.
You bring us a lot. Thank you, Melissa. And last but not least, hailing from my Maryland, Officer Don Bridges has also been a longtime friend and partner of ours at Safe and Sound Schools. We really wanted to make sure that we were representing some boots on the ground SRO perspective. One of our strongest partners in terms of SRO programs in the nation is in Baltimore County, where Don serves, and has so much experience there building an incredible program. So we're just so excited to have you here, Don, to tell us a little bit about what you're seeing in your community as well.
Well, I can tell you that, first of all, I am grateful to be here and to represent the 16,000 SROs throughout the country.
No pressure.
That do an amazing job. And I would also add that what is so very critical is that we continue to come to quality training such as this. When we look at our summers would be void if we did not get this opportunity to attend the training and to have the opportunity to collaborate with organizations like Safe and Sound. Guys, what we're seeing in this school safety industry now are amazing challenges. We started our program back in 1998 with 2 officers, and today we have in excess of 70. And what is so critical is that we continue to allow our officers the opportunity to get quality training. And when we come into venues like this, we share what we're seeing. We're seeing lots and lots of threats, and what we have to do is we have to collaborate with our partners within education, and we have to also make sure that every threat is investigated to its fullest extent. So I commend you guys as the SROs, as the boots on the ground, for the great work that you do, and for also coming to this conference so that you can take this training back and do the job of making sure that all of our children are safe and secure.
Excellent. Well, that rounds out our table, guys. Just want to give you a little bit of background about the study. I've given you some as we've been talking our way through. We are so grateful for the support of 2 of our partners this year, Raptor Technologies, who always plays a big role here at NASRO. Actually, that's how we first connected with Raptor, and they've been with us as supporting partners for years and years now. We are also joined by another partner, Lightspeed Systems. So both of these groups are here. I encourage you to visit with them, thank them for supporting this entire project and all of the details that have gone into putting forth this presentation for all of you here today. So thank you to our partners. Just to dig in so that you have background about the report itself, it's been taking place now for 5 years nationally. We usually get around 2,000. This year we had almost 2,600 participants. We're really careful about trying to strike a balance of those perspectives. Those of you who know Safe and Sound Schools and our partners here know that the multidisciplinary approach is at the core of everything that we do. So it's really important to us that everybody has a voice in this, and ever more so in this report, that we are hearing from a lot of different school stakeholders or people that have a stake in our schools. So the basic breakdown here among students, parents, educators, and public safety, you can see on this slide here. We always get a pretty good representation of students, believe it or not. We have our students, our parents, also a nice solid chunk. They make up a nice solid group. We're a little bit light on public safety, just issuing a challenge for next year. We could use more SRO participation. We, in that public safety category, include law enforcement, emergency response, SROs, anybody who has a security background, that's who comprises that group. And of course, we have a lot of educators as well. Educators representing administrators, school-based mental health professionals, school staff, school support staff, even bus drivers are considered part of that bucket there. So that's who we're talking about here today. Virtually everyone and anyone who has any kind of stake in our schools. Just a little bit of the breakdown in terms of location. We also try to strike a balance in the different types of schools, because we know that there is a big difference in how urban, suburban, and rural schools have to prepare, as well as what kinds of resources each of those schools might have. So here's a little bit of a breakdown of the balance there in terms of different types of communities that are participating. And here's the breakdown demographically. Again, we have kind of combined some of our categories, but we have the bulk of our participants identifying as white. The next group in size would be African American and Black. We have Hispanic, and then we have a smaller portion that is Asian and Pacific Islander, and Native American and Alaskan. So that's our breakdown. Each year we strive to try to achieve a better balance there. This continues to grow and improve for us each year, but we can only improve that with greater participation. So again, issuing you a little challenge there to make sure that you're reaching out to many people to participate each year when we hold this study. So digging right in, we're going to start with the category of preparedness. And the very first question we ask every year is, how safe do you feel in school? So kind of a standout from the data showed a disconnect, as we see year over year, unfortunately, between what our students are feeling and perceiving in terms of safety and the grown-ups. So if I divide all of the people in the pie chart down the middle or into two categories, we've got our students, and then we've got all of us adults, right, that are busy doing the work and perhaps not communicating as well as we could what kind of stuff is happening behind the scenes, what plans are in place, and perhaps even taking in their feedback, taking in student information and concerns. So I want to start here because I feel like this is the reason we all do this, right? We want our kids to feel safe and sound in school so that they can grow and learn, but we're continuing to see this disconnect. So I thought we might start our conversation with you, Dawn, being boots on the ground, to talk a little bit about what is making students feel safe in your community, or what you feel like is being done to support that feeling of safety.
Well, I think when we look at all that is in the media, when we look at the state of the country, our students are very in tune with the acts of violence that are going on throughout our country. And one thing we know is that when we operate within a school, students have their own culture, their own way of doing things. So one of the benefits of the SRO position is the engagement piece. Mm-hmm. If we continue to work hard to further engage with our students, we would see that number go up. So some of the challenges that I think we can leave our SROs with is continue to engage your students. And I feel that if we would do that more, and I think we do a fantastic job, we can always do better in anything that we do. I think that the engagement piece would increase that percentage to a portion that will be closer to where the educators are.
So I want to dig in on what you just said about the engagement, because I think probably Teresa would agree here that our students are our chief consumers of the media, right? That might be where they're getting most of their news, where they're learning about things that are going on in the community. And recently there was an article from Ed Week, and unfortunately you have to subscribe to get those, but being a former teacher, I'm always keeping my thumb on what's going on in those conversations. But the conversation was about how teachers and students are reporting feeling safer when there's a school resource officer, overwhelmingly in the study. And I have to think that what you just touched on, Don, about the engagement piece, that immediate face-to-face content and receiving news and receiving comfort and receiving kind of communication from your trusted school resource officer could be part of that. Anybody want to dig in on that?
I think I would just jump in to say the experience that I've had this year in Canada, where the SROs have been removed, we are, first of all, actual violent incidents have gone through the roof, but upon interviews within those students in schools, they're not feeling safe. They've created some of their own movements. It's the city of Vancouver that I'm referring to. So that's really important to keep in mind, that the SROs bring such a sense of safety to our schools each and every day. The only other thing I wanted to just touch on the feeling safe at school, a lot of time in the aftermath of high-profile incidents of violence, when we're involved in interviewing young people, and we start to ask them questions about, do they feel safe in their school? And again, I'm asking face-to-face. I ask that question, but I also ask, has anyone ever asked you that before? Mm-hmm. And most often kids say no, maybe on a survey. So I would just throw a challenge out to all of you to think back to if you've ever asked your students if there's a place in the school they don't feel safe, because these kids didn't know me, and I was hearing about hallways of death that have been in place for 9 years. Superintendents had no idea. Asking if there's somebody that makes them feel unsafe in the school and why. Same thing, no one's ever asked me that before. And unfortunately, we do have puppet masters in our schools, so if we're not asking, that they fly under the radar, and a lot of that harm and impacting the feelings of safety at school is happening online, unfortunately. So I really encourage each and every one of you to talk to kids, ask them to show you where they don't feel safe, and typically they have good intel behind why they don't feel safe in that area of the school.
May I add something also?
Please.
One of the things we emphasize, and I would think that the majority of the SROs that are here today, they've gone through our 40-hour basic SRO course. And what I always recommend to SROs is to execute that triad. That triad means you're going to be in the classroom. And when you're in the classroom, that's where relationships are built. That classroom is their safe haven. And that is where we start to help our students to build that sense of comfort.
Absolutely. I want to point out that this report, you guys are getting a sneak peek of it. It won't be released until the 19th, but you will be able to delve into a lot of these topics that we are touching on and see the data, see the reporting from all of the different stakeholders broken down as well. Go ahead, John.
Yeah, just kind of following up. One of the difficulties with bipolar questions, do you feel safe or not? You miss a big ground. One of the things we see working with kids is a lot of their threats are coming from invisible things that adults don't see. Specifically, so if you're asking a kid if they feel safe and they say no, you should behavioralize what's going on. And one of the things you'll find is that a lot of the things the kids are reporting make them feel unsafe are what we call social and psychological disruptions. It's not necessarily a mass casualty shooter, it's the day-to-day interaction that nobody picks up except for the little ones.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Michelle, we saw this coming, right?
We did.
It was just a few weeks into the official start of the pandemic that we were having conversations with school psychologists, with Michelle and her folks, about what is school going to look like when it starts back. And certainly going back to about April of 2020, none of us at that point, I thought it would be as long as it was.
Right.
And so we were already concerned then. When you factor in adolescent brain development, that certainly is on my mind as I look at this piece of data. As you factor in social media, which from my opinion may wind up being the worst things that ever happened to our society. When you throw in, the circumstances of the entire George Floyd situation and the dynamics from that, that's a lot to think about for adults, but for adolescents, it's on a completely different level. We know from studying adolescent brain development that, I'm going to simplify this in a way, but that adolescents think with their feelings.
Yes.
And so there's a lot of feelings that certainly go into this. Not that adults don't have feelings about it, but when we look at a piece of data like this, I do wonder how much all of those variables impact that.
Without a doubt.
Yeah. Well, and with the disruption of COVID, unfortunately paired with social and political unrest, and then higher incidences of targeted violence, kids also lost their safe place, which for many of our kids was schools. And having those connections and those relationships with adults is so critical, and so many kids lost that. So I think it's a combination of a lot of different things feeding into this. I also think that we could do a much, much better job of engaging student leadership in regards to safety efforts. And one of the things that we teach in the Prepare curriculum are those multidisciplinary safety teams and crisis teams for which SROs are critical members. But as part of those teams of adults, it's also how do the students have a voice? And Safe and Sound Schools, and Michelle, I'll let you talk a little bit about this, has a fabulous program where the students are engaged in school safety leadership. And I think when you, as part of SROs, could help get some of those programs up and running within your schools and engaging your school mental health professionals and administrators to get that program up and running, it does give the student a voice. And not only then do they give us good insight and information as to what's working, what's not working, but I also think that increases connectedness, it increases relationships, which then also increases feelings of both physical and psychological safety. So they need a voice.
How many of you SROs have, or even if you are an educator as well, who's here, I hope you're here, school-based mental health professionals, I hope you're here too, but obviously SROs, how many of you already have a student safety program or club of some kind that you are running or that exists in your school? Show of hands. Something student-centric. Okay. So as Melissa's saying, what an incredible opportunity to engage, as Don is saying, to bring their voice into it. As you guys are saying, John and Teresa, we really want to engage their voice. We want to show them that we care about what they have to say. We have a program at Safe and Sound Schools that you can download. It's called Safe and Sound Students. And it really just kind of exists as a way for you to start your own charter if you don't already have one, or if you have one and you just want to expand upon it and explore some of those ideas. We've had some really phenomenal kids from across the country. The leadership, they're amazing. They're just amazing. So they're an untapped resource in many, many ways. Thank you for that. I'll give you some money later. Another little disconnect, and maybe not so little, that we noticed in terms of emergency preparedness is between our educators and our public safety. And again, the public safety, that's you guys, as well as a lot of your counterparts outside of the school community, and educators. And I'm coming from that educator background. So I have my own thoughts about why we might be seeing a disconnect like this in terms of level of preparedness. And one of those things is, as Melissa, we say all the time, like the letters after our name, right? The letters after my name enable me to teach anybody I can teach just about anybody how to read, really. I can deal with all kinds of different disabilities in the classroom. I can teach kids from, kindergarten all the way up through 8th grade. But I don't have the background that Don Bridges has, that Mo Kennedy has, that, I don't have that public safety perspective. It's not in my DNA. So I don't know if it's just that it's not so much on the educator's radar. Believe me, there's too much already on their radar at this moment. Or if it's just the fact that our public safety professionals are aware of a lot more that's going on under the surface. So reactions here?
I can start as a police psychologist and working with cops for many years. When you all go to a restaurant, you sit with your back to the wall. You know,
We've learned to save them a seat so that they can see the entrance and exit when we eat out.
every person's a potential suspect.
Yeah.
So I think from a law enforcement standpoint, they're very safety conscious, and it's never going to be enough because they see what happens when it's not enough.
And it's a unique and valuable perspective in this multidisciplinary approach to safety.
Yeah, you
really,
wouldn't want to
truly.
change that.
No, you wouldn't. You wouldn't. I feel like sometimes there's a tug of war between our educators and our public safety professionals, and maybe it's okay that we see the numbers like this because people are comfortable in their silos and their areas of expertise. But it is a reality that we need to continue to approach.
And I think too, schools have definitely increased their preparedness training and resources. But I will also say, having done a lot of work with school districts across the country, they're not always engaging their community professionals and those that are in the safety arena into that planning. So I mean, as we heard this morning, just talking about reunification sites, the charter school had said this is where the reunification site's going to be, and law enforcement was saying this is where we want it to be. A lot of times I think that's could be one of the reasons why you have the higher number of educators feeling more comfortable is we are doing a lot more in schools in regards to emergency preparedness, but we are not doing a good job of engaging our collaborative partners.
100%.
And in some school districts, they have multiple police agencies they're working with. They may have more than one fire district they're working with, and it becomes very complex. And there's not always a dedicated position, at least for school districts, to do the emergency planning and preparedness. A lot of times it's added onto a lot of different people's plates. So you don't have that one position dedicated to bringing all those people together.
You have created a beautiful segue for us into the topic of reunification here. And it was, heartbreaking to hear about reunification this morning and how that unfolded. Particularly for me, with our experience at Sandy Hook, I think a lot of us, jump in and share our lessons learned with folks like you who we know will go back and put them to work, right? We learned a lot of very, very painful lessons at Sandy Hook about reunification. We did have a plan, we being the educators. I'm always going to identify with the educators even though I was a parent fully in that moment. And so to hear that, that disconnect between what the educator plan or the school plan is and what the community or the public safety plan is, and that they are so vastly different and not even related is a huge area of concern that I would like for each of you to take on as a challenge, as something to focus on. But you see here in this reporting of the data, I want to point out that the numbers all the way on the left side, I don't know if you brought your readers or not, but on the left side it goes all the way up to 80. So I want you to imagine that it goes even higher because if that graph goes all the way up to 100% on the left side, then I think you can better appreciate these bars. Remember, I'm a teacher, so if our students are reporting 70% agreement that their school knows what to do in a reunification event, and our parents are coming in at 75, our educators are only coming in at about 67, and our public safety folks, per John's comment, really an alarming 36% are feeling like this is, ready to go. So there's a lot to talk about here. There's a lot of concern. But again, to me, the best case here is that we're scoring a C, right? That's my teacher talk there. And the worst case is an absolute E, like below, nowhere near even passing. So while we have made incredible progress over the last at least decade in reunification, and we are here in Colorado, so I want to point out the work of the I Love You Guys Foundation. I know we have some I Love You Guys folks in the crowd, and so I think a lot of that work has come from the organization of I Love You Guys and the SRM that's been put out there and put into good use. So we're moving the needle, we know, but this shows that we really have a lot more work to do. Thoughts?
Well, I think that this relationship, this partnership with educators, it is a constant work. And it's something where, like, we as SROs, we have to stay the course. And I think that when we look at the percentages, we're going to always, from the law enforcement perspective, we're going to always look at it with a very, very critical eye. Mm-hmm. We're going to see everything that is wrong, and our ultimate goal is 100%. So no matter what that number says, our goal will always be, we want to make sure that everything is in place and that we're practicing these drills and that everyone is on board. And I think that we have to just realize that we can never give up and that this relationship building piece is a constant work.
It is a constant work. It absolutely is.
I'm glad that you pointed out, I love you guys.
Mm-hmm.
Since John, Michael, and Ellen started this, and now when I hear reunification, that's exactly
who
what I
you
think
think of.
about. So if you don't know about I love you guys, you need to know about them.
Yeah, and you know, Melissa and I have a reunification workshop that we do through Safe and Sound, and obviously pointing a lot to the work of I Love You Guys, the SRM, and several of the other different sources that are out there to utilize. I do want to congratulate everybody for a lot of good work. I think this is progress compared to what I saw and experienced at Sandy Hook and then stepping into the field, 10 years ago. We do have a lot of work to do, and we do need to constantly keep that conversation going.
Can I add something? I would encourage the SROs in the room to take a picture of this slide and take this knowledge, take this information, and make it what educators call a teachable moment.
We like our data.
Absolutely. And what you do is when you are a part of that staff development, that new teacher orientation, leave your school with a challenge. Leave them with a challenge. Explain this survey, explain this data to them, and make this your charge for the upcoming school year. And that is bringing back the value that your agency paid and for you to attend this conference. This would be an amazing challenge for every school in the country.
Well, I'm going to do you one better. I think pictures are always great as a little reminder, and I do want you to feel free to take pictures throughout this presentation. But when this report is released on the 19th, you will have the whole slide deck. You will have all of these graphics. Everything will be, ready for you to take and present and share back with your community. So great challenge, great idea.
Can I add one thing before
Please.
you say? Again, looking at being on scene at Columbine in Platte Canyon, and you got to look at the definition of reunification. For parents, it's being with their kids. For cops, they have multiple demands.
That's right.
Some of them made an entry into the school. They got safety. They got so many things on their mind. So the reality is, I don't think that'll ever get higher.
It's a good point. It's a good reality check for us. Mm-hmm. I want to bridge us to one more area of preparedness, and I promise you there's much more for you to delve into, but our time is short. So one other thing that I wanted to share, because this is very, very important to me personally, and a lot of you as well, and that is planning for the needs of individuals with special needs in the community, or access and functional needs, as our emergency managers like to call it. As many of you know, my daughter, who was killed at Sandy Hook, was a child who had an awful lot of those special needs. She had mobility challenges, she was nonverbal and apraxic, she had visual impairment, speech impairment. So those are a lot of really important things, factors that go into how we plan for her safety, right? We do a lot of work, all of us, in terms of school safety, preparedness, planning, big things like reunification. All of those, though, are plans that are existing at more of a higher level, right? And that's fine. We have to be able to look at it from that high level as a place to start. We at Safe and Sound have a program that we launched. Some of you are making good use of it. It's called Especially Safe, and it is about helping you all prepare and plan for the needs of individuals with special needs in your community, because there's not one person, student, staff member that's going to have the same exact set of needs. But when you get into the area of individuals with access and functional needs, you really got to be planning specifically. You can't have that one-size-fits-all approach. So I would encourage you to check that out as a resource. And again, take a look at this data. Now, the scale on the left only goes up to 90%. So we're still kind of in the C range, which is a little better than I would have thought. I really feel like this topic of school safety is gaining more traction. But I want to open it up to our table here for insights.
Yeah. One of the things that we are highly encouraging schools to do is to attach an IEP to the IEP. So many of you, especially if you've been through the NASRO training, know that students with special needs, many of them are receiving special education services, and they have an individualized education plan. They also need to have an individualized emergency and evacuation plan. And that could be woven into the special education process. So as we are doing an initial psychoeducational assessment, if they end up qualifying, it's not just what do we look at for their educational programming, but what do we need to look at if there is an emergency. If they're already receiving special education services and you haven't looked at this area before, when you have that annual review, or you pull the team together with the parents and you develop what we kind of call that second IEP, and you want to make sure that you're reviewing that at least on an annual basis when you have their typical special education IEP review. Or if they transition schools for special education students, we always have a transition meeting. Usually, best practice is you have a transition meeting with the new school. So then what would that individualized emergency and evacuation plan look like for that student at the new school? So there's ways that, as I say, I'm one that we all have so much to do. We don't need to build a new road a lot of times. We just need to attach things to existing roads that are already built. So linking it to that special education process is a very natural way to do it. You just 100%. Add another topic to the meeting. But also, special needs is beyond those that are receiving special education services. If you have grandparent volunteers that have mobility issues and an emergency happens, what do they need in order to safely evacuate? Or do they have medical needs if you're in a lockdown for an extended period of time? Your teachers that may have special needs, hearing impaired, they're not going to be able to hear the emergency announcement. So it's beyond just students receiving special education services, but that's where, again, that multidisciplinary team with different perspectives comes into play, and you're thinking through what are all those things we can address.
And you can find that plan. You can download that plan on our website at safeandsoundschools.org. It is under Especially Safe. We call it the individual safety plan. Yeah. We also encourage leveraging that natural planning process of the IEP process. But we are, looking at this document, this individual safety plan, as something separate, something that is nimble, easily adapted, can be changed, and also can accommodate individuals who maybe don't have an individual education plan. We'll talk more about that tomorrow. I have a workshop on Especially Safe, and I'll be joined by a couple other awesome special educators and an SRO in that session as well. So we'll come back to that conversation. It's a big one. So leaving the preparedness kind of category in the report, we're now heading into some of the data about ongoing threats to safety that our students are reporting, our parents are reporting, our educators are concerned about, as well as our public safety. And it's always here, guys. I feel like we've been talking about bullying as long as I can remember, since I was a kid, I'm sure before that. It's a long-standing issue that we continue to try to tackle, and I gotta be honest, we don't seem to be making a whole lot of headway in this category. To make it a little bit more challenging, we now have cyber, online, all of these different factors that are morphing into another whole category of cyberbullying. And here you see kind of a standout, and this is the 60% is the percentage of students who feel prepared for something like this happening in their school community. That's a D. And then 79% of educators feeling that they're prepared. So we're in the C+ range there, right? Doing a little bit better. An obvious disconnect, but I want to throw this out to the table to see what your thoughts are in this category.
Okay, I can jump in. Remember at Cherry Creek when Linda was there and Bill Porter was there and you all did the bullying. So I'm coming from a different perspective. To me, bullying is a bumper sticker and it creates more problems. Because if you look at the behavior under bullying, it's an umbrella that would have teasing on one end, which we would call social and psychological disruption, to pushing somebody down the stairs. So I think it actually causes, which is why students don't feel safe, because they're looking at bullying a lot different. I think what we try and do with school district is take that word away and behavioralize what you're doing.
Excellent point. And because, think about trying to collect data. What is bullying to you? And what is bullying to me? And what is bullying? There's a lot of, I like you're kind of referring to a spectrum there of different behaviors. And I know as a classroom teacher, this was a conversation we were having a lot. And sometimes some of the behaviors that students were struggling with, they weren't bullying behaviors. They might be some teasing, they might be some ignoring, it might be that that person just doesn't want to be friends with you. Some of those kind of miscommunications. So I think that's really a brilliant point, is that let's get away from this kind of ambiguous term and let's start targeting actual behaviors.
I think the other thing I would add is one of the most important teaching points, which builds on what John just mentioned, is we've got to express the difference between what is the difference between mean behavior, peer conflict, and bullying behavior, because until we do that, whatever assessment or interventions we apply will not be successful. So we have a phenomenal resource available for free. We have it in a 4-minute video, plus a printout that I really encourage people to share with your teachers, share with your parents, so that when we come together to talk about these certain incidents that we're talking about the same thing with mean behavior, peer conflict, or bullying behavior. On the cyber part, our data shows that we have seen an increase of over 300% in cyberbullying cases. I think it's 342%. That's based on a
Say that again?
increase of 342%
Wow.
pre-pandemic. So that's based on a Canadian data set, because we are the subject matter experts in Canada and British Columbia. Those worrisome online behavior reports, our threat analysts, we provide those for every single school district in the province of British Columbia. So we had all of that data pre and post. I don't think any of us in this room are surprised that at a time when we put our kids online more during the pandemic that we're seeing what we're seeing. And I like to use the acronym ASA, and that's just the access, the scope, and the anonymity have provided the cyberbullying cases that we see today. I also want to caution people about underreacting to some cases that are go kill yourself. And you've got 50 individuals on an Instagram group message telling a student to go kill themselves. And tragically, we've had to deal with the aftermath of that child taking their life. How we pull those cases apart has to be recognizing what was the intent of every single person within that chat. So when we're talking about cyberbullying, it's really important that we're taking a step back. No two kids are the same. And there's no two motives for being involved in that situation. I can tell you, unfortunately, we do have a lot of kids that are just pressing the go kill yourself, without actually any real ill intent. But yet we have this, what I like to call the innovator, that started that web page, who actually was the one that really wanted to cause harm and was hoping to watch somebody harm themselves. So caution of underreacting, but also making sure that it's one case at a time and every student at a time. And same thing with those resources. We have a number of resources available, checklists, other things, just to make sure we don't miss anything. In British Columbia, they launched what's called the Erase Initiative. It's Expect, Respect, and a Safe Education in 2012, which included, I'm not allowed to say mandated, they say voluntold, 5 full days of training focusing on culture, climate, bullying, cyberbullying, sextortion, because we've also seen a major increase in sextortion, which is getting lumped into cyberbullying, but it really shouldn't. It's an individual behavior on its own.
So what we're really bridging into here, as we're talking about a lot of these behaviors, is that peer-on-peer abuse. You know, whether we're talking about a physical abuse, online cyberbullying, those types of things, and a few more of these issues that I'm going to highlight here. Sexual assault and abuse, again, I'm going to point you to the scale. It only goes up to 90 in this category. So we're looking at bars that, you know, barely break 50%. In confidence for preparedness in terms of how a case of sexual assault or abuse will be handled, in terms of how students are perceiving. Educators much higher, looking at more like 76%. Public safety and parents are net about the same, in the low 60s there. And then taking a closer look at this issue, what we see when we break it down comparing students and educators, we've actually got students at 54% here, feeling prepared, feeling that their school is prepared, and then educators at 77%. So another great disconnect there, another opportunity for continued conversation. I think to John's and Teresa's points too, really defining for our kids, what does it mean? What are we talking about? And I'm going to come back to your point, John, about talking about behaviors, because some of these broad topics like sexual abuse, assault, cyberbullying, bullying, they're not necessarily kid-friendly, and they are non-specific terms. I'm going to keep us moving into an issue that you kind of touched on, Teresa, in this conversation, and sadly, I think, Don, we're seeing this at the local levels as well. Educators are not much for conversation about this, I notice. You and I were talking about this. Mm-hmm. This is a bit taboo, to be honest, in a lot of educator circles, school staff circles, the issues of youth trafficking. I think that does come back to some terminology issues. I think a lot of us who are grown-ups think of trafficking. We're thinking of a very different kind of human trafficking, sex trafficking, than what it has evolved to today in our communities and with youth. So there is an awful lot of opportunity to open up conversations and education. Here we see public safety, who likely has the greatest awareness of these issues in and around the community at only 30% confidence, and unprepared in public safety at 47%. So very high levels of dissatisfaction or feeling unprepared. So I don't know, Don, how is that in our area in Baltimore?
Well, I would say this. I would say we as SROs, if you look at many of the categories that we have discussed thus far, so much of it deals with school resource officers having a relationship with leadership within school buildings all over the country. And when you have that relationship, they're then afforded the opportunity to do staff development training. Much of it can be addressed through training, letting educators know what they're actually looking at. And I just think that when we talk about the role of the SRO, I keep going back to executing that triad. And then a key component of like every aspect of our job and every aspect of student safety and school safety is deeply rooted in education, staff development training, getting into the classroom with students, educating them. We do classes where we're teaching kids about responsible dating. It is all within our lane, and it's so important that we get out there and make getting into the classroom a priority. Make getting in front of your staff a priority.
100%. I do think that staff education piece, and I think we have to be honest with our educators. Look, we're not expecting you to become expert like us, but you can be aware of the indicators, you can be aware of the behaviors. Here's some things to keep a lookout for. And oh, by the way, if you see them, or if you even have a sense that maybe, you can come to me. Or you can report using our anonymous tip line, or what are the mechanisms for handing it off or bringing it to the multidisciplinary school.
Can I add something? Sure. And I think that when we are really engaged within our schools, our presence, our role, our presence in those schools really plays a lot in terms of making sure that our schools have what I would call a healthy culture in climate.
Culture. There's the word.
And I think too, in schools, we are struggling to get some to understand that school safety is more than just targeted, violent attacks. They get so focused on how do we make sure that our schools are prepared for a targeted attack that we're failing to see that all of these areas also fit into school safety. And we need to be having these conversations with students. We need to be integrating this into much of the safety curriculums that we're doing in schools. But one of the challenges we're now having, and a lot of this is politically motivated, is schools are now being told what they can and they cannot talk about. And so we're not addressing some of these sensitive topics. And so you have these kids that are getting lured into some of these behaviors through video games, through websites, and they don't know initially that this is what they're being groomed for.
That's right.
And then next thing you know, boom, they're in it, and then they're too afraid to say anything because we haven't opened up those conversations. It's the same with relationships. We now have kids getting online, being exposed to some very sexually exploitive graphics and information, and they're thinking that that's okay. They don't know what healthy relationships are anymore. So some of them were sexually assaulted, but they don't even identify that they were sexually assaulted at the beginning because they thought that that was a normal relationship. I don't even know what normal is. But we need to be able to open up these dialogues within schools, do really good digital citizenship training,
Absolutely.
training on what are healthy relationships, and open up the conversations that if you find yourself in a tough spot, go to that trusted adult. And I don't think we are doing that enough in schools. And in some places, we're not allowed to do that in schools. And we're putting kids at risk because we're not able to have those conversations.
And I think similar to the conversations with students and with the community about things like trafficking, youth trafficking, and what grooming looks like and what you're being exposed to, gang activity and recruitment. And some of you might look at this slide and think, oh my goodness, my little northeastern community, we don't have to worry about this here. We're a rural community. I think Teresa might beg to differ, as well as I think there is a level of uncertainty as reflected in this data. The scale on the left goes only as high as 60%. So across the board, we have a lot of people who feel unsure about even what it is, what to do. Are they prepared for this in their communities? And it really doesn't discriminate any longer. It is making its way into, suburban communities. It's making its way into communities that, are unfortunately not realizing it until after the fact.
Well, I think that school districts across the country, they're finding very, very hard to hit the reset button from COVID.
Sure.
That button has not been hit yet. So when we start looking at kids not having the opportunity to have been in the safest places they can go with their schools, that is problematic.
Yeah, it's not like the lights just went on and we're back in business. There are an awful lot of repercussions here.
Yeah, and I think just like we were talking previously with the trafficking, what's happening now with our young people online is some of you may have seen the TikTok challenge, Expose Myself. So they share all their hypothesized risk enhancers of all the things going wrong in their life, mom's in jail, all of these other things. Well, most often it's our gang members or our traffickers that are getting to those kids before it becomes on our radar, and that's something to be mindful of. So we often know who those targets will be in our schools. It's incredible to see on Snapchat and TikTok how many people will take a picture in a school hallway and hit me up at my SC, my Snapchat username. It's all there. We can go on Snap Maps right now and I can find a drug dealer like right here in Aurora. So it's all there once we become more comfortable on recognizing what our digital baselines are. Our kids have digital baselines, our schools and communities have baselines. So it's helpful to invest some time to find out what are those key behaviors that are impacting your kids.
I want to point out too, Mo, I think we have a workshop. I'm trying to remember desperately. I can't memorize all of the amazing breakouts. But we have one for trafficking on deck. So those of you who are ready to learn a little bit more, that's a must attend. So another topic, obviously, COVID heavily impacted, of course, food insecurity, another similar topic, homelessness among our students. I'm going to kind of toggle back and forth here.
Can I just weigh in on
Please
that for
do.
a second? And listen, as a former SRO, and I know we can all kind of go through this. Before I became an SRO in 1999, the issue of free and reduced lunch wasn't even on my radar. Food insecurity for kids,
Right.
homelessness, I'm just telling you, and if you're being honest, you're probably saying the same thing to me before you became an SRO, not even on my radar. If it is, it's barely. But after becoming an SRO and seeing really, you got preaching to the choir right here, but we get it now, seeing some of the circumstances that kids come from that are unimaginable for probably most of us in this room. If that doesn't impact you as an SRO, as a human being, we may all be in the wrong field. It really has impacted me and I don't understand some of the situations kids are coming from. But I also was, and I'm sorry to go backward a little bit, but along with this, the issue of sexual assault, of abuse, of neglect, let's even try to unpack that in terms of, after the lockdown and kids couldn't be in school. We've got kids, again, missing the very best part of the day they could hope to have. That's right. The best meal they're going to have, the best adult interaction. And one thing we didn't talk about a few minutes ago in rolling that out is, all of those sexual assault cases that occur in the community, the domestic abuse issues that occur around kids in the community, all those cases that we're used to catching at school and being able to deal with, and we weren't able to catch those.
That's right.
That weighs heavy on me, and I think we'll be years unpacking that, unfortunately.
Yeah, you said at one point, Melissa, we're talking a decade minimally, right? For
Yes.
impact, really, truly, when you think about all of those impacts, those issues were there, and issues like food insecurity, homelessness, abuse at home, neglect at home, which that's all unpacked in this survey as well. A lot of those are kind of invisible to school staff, to community members, and kids will go to great lengths to hide that situation from adults. So it's ever more important that we have those trusted relationships. A lot of our kids will go to the SRO way before they'll admit or embarrass themselves in front of the teacher or the counselor. So those are critical to be aware of. And before we move on, in terms of food insecurity, homelessness, those things that we would call basic needs for a lot of our kids. Another great session that you might like to attend if that is weighing on you, as Mo says, there's a session that we'll have tomorrow on bright futures. It's called Bright Futures. Is Frederick County in the house here? Do I have our Frederick County folks in here? We have a crew from Frederick County, Virginia, SROs and educators together, who've done some extraordinary work with this program, really wrapping our SROs into meeting kids' basic needs and developing relationships. And what it has done for that community and for those kids is it will fill your cup, Mo. So you should check that out. In terms of homelessness, I think a lot of the data here definitely reflective of the COVID experience, without a doubt, because nationally we saw food insecurity and homelessness rising, dramatically. So students saying 54% confidence in this area in terms of how the school community could respond to a child who's dealing with homelessness, and 81 for educators. So obviously a very, very big disconnect. Yeah. Thoughts on this?
I think it's hard to meet the needs of many of the families that are experiencing a lot of these adverse situations without having the community partnership. Mm-hmm. So again, that's where I think schools may think they're doing a pretty good job of that, but when it actually comes to truly meeting the needs of the kids and the families, they're saying, no, they're not.
Yeah.
And again, it requires way more than what schools have the resources to do. So
Truly.
It goes back to those community partnerships to really meet the needs of many of these families. And with the inflation that's going on right now, this is only going to get worse.
Yeah.
I mean, these are data before inflation really started to hit this country.
Indeed.
Just within the past few months. And I think these kinds of adverse situations are going to be even greater
Yeah,
within our
absolutely.
students.
I think, on the surface, it can look like everything is fine, but to your point, programs like A Bright Futures and incorporating the SRO who can interact with students well beyond the bells of the day, who might see the students out in the community, is something that we want to take back to our communities because we'll be dealing with this challenge for quite some time.
One of the things that we talk about during our SRO training is that all school resource officers should know their schools. And then what I mean when I say that, schools are data driven. They have all of the data to let you know, and it's public, as to what percentage of your student body is receiving free or reduced lunches. You need to understand that so that you know who you're serving. You cannot serve your school if you don't understand what the data is.
Truly.
And some of the states have actually started the Handle with Care program
Yes.
that
Which is
that law
also
enforcement
featured.
is doing.
There's also a Handle with Care workshop.
Yes, and that has been a great program in states that have started it, to where if law enforcement ends up responding to a home for some situation and they notice some things that are going on, they have permission to communicate to the school administrator, who then can make sure that proactively the school is meeting the needs of that particular student. So for example, if they're called out to a home and there's a domestic violence arrest, they could discreetly communicate back to the school. So, geez, if that child is acting out in school that day, probably because of what happened at home that night. They're not trying to be oppositional, defiant, conduct disordered, ADHD. It's in response to an adverse situation that happened at home. Or if they go into a home and they notice this family doesn't have any food, they don't have any beds to sleep on, they could then communicate that discreetly back to the school, where then the school could activate these kinds of programs to really rally around that family. So I think those kinds of programs that also allow local law enforcement to communicate to the SROs and the school administrators make a huge difference for a lot of these families.
And that ends up being a situation where you as the SRO, you are living up to your name. You're that resource. And I think when we share some of the situations that our students face in the community, it makes us so very valuable to the school.
100%. I'm putting this slide up only to just touch on it because I want to keep our conversation moving, and because in terms of infectious disease like COVID, flu, what's the latest, monkeypox, and we're now living in an era of pandemic. I think we can all, we all have to face. So this is going to continue to be something that is now part of our school safety umbrella, folks. We have for the past couple years added this category into the survey. So I would regard this year and last year as kind of like your baseline for this topic. Obviously, it really does have a lot of impact on our educators and our public safety professionals. They're going to get pulled in. Our school nurses, oh my gosh, unsung heroes of the pandemic in our school communities. So just sharing that and keeping our conversation moving along. Another big issue, obviously related to some of the things we were talking about earlier, digital threats and cyber attacks. Now, Baltimore County was victim of, a major cyber attack. Any community members that experienced some of these ransomware cyber attacks here in this community, in a lot of communities, we're not really talking about that openly, but that's something that we are seeing with increasing frequency, and digital threats. Instead of calling in a bomb threat, now using digital platforms to put that word out or terrorize the community. So taking a look at the scale here goes up to 70%. So these bars are pretty low, with public safety maybe around 44%, and our kids coming in around 53% in terms of confidence. So definitely the expert here at the table, Teresa, some thoughts here on these continuing issues for our school communities.
Yeah, I think we need to stay the course and continue to train in digital threat assessment to equip more of you with the skills to assess and respond to these digital threats. One of the things we did see, and you touched on it, is a major increase this year in bomb threats being rerouted using VPNs. And how do we then investigate those? We want to be able to provide you with all of those tools and resources that you need. I don't imagine that we're going to see those digital threats, those bomb threats go down in the coming year. So we'd rather work with you and provide you with all those investigative tools. We have a number of different kind of cheat sheets for just kind of initial steps to follow. Schools really need it as well, because we need schools to get better information when they're receiving these new types of bomb threats. So we're happy to make that information available to you as well.
This was referenced just a couple minutes ago in terms of mental health. So we're really kind of moving into the mental health category of the report. And as you might imagine, reports of anxiety and depression both dramatically increasing, nationwide, but very obviously in our schools, which are the microcosms of our, our society. So these I want to point to our two mental health experts here and get a little bit of insight from each of you.
Well, the data is really clear.
I know.
Unfortunately, we are seeing significant increases in anxiety and depression, not only amongst our students, but also amongst our educators and our staff. And I can honestly say in my 20 years in education, I am seeing our educators stressed at a level that I have never seen in 20 years. So it makes it more challenging when you have the caregivers that are also just as impacted as many of the students. But we also know that one of the ways that we can counter this within schools, and this is even where school resource officers can be engaged, is what we refer to as social emotional learning. And this is where we are teaching skills. Just like we teach reading, writing, and math, we need to get in there and we need to teach skills around anxiety management. What are the skills that you can use if you find yourself not in a good space, having a lot of negative thinking? How do we have healthy relationships, problem solving, conflict resolution, empathy? If we can build those social emotional skills, we lessen anxiety and depression. And through those kinds of curriculums, what we're also doing is we're building relationships. The data was also really clear during COVID, is that those individuals, whether it was adolescents or adults, those that felt like they had social connections had lower rates of anxiety and depression. But you have to have good skills, good social skills, and emotional stability to have those healthy relationships, which then lead to lower rates of anxiety and depression. So we know what works. We just have to be able to do more of it. And unfortunately, there are places in this country where you have specific groups trying to ban social emotional learning happening in schools. They do not want any of those skills taught. And I'm like, what? Right. This is just teaching us how to be healthy individuals, but also how to have healthy relationships and care about each other. How can you not want your kids to have those kinds of skills? But unfortunately, there are groups that have put politics behind it and are trying to prohibit those kinds of things from happening in schools. As I say to educators, then call it something different. But we have to do these things in schools.
Yeah, and I think that's where we are really, is looking at, I don't think we did ourselves a favor when it was called social emotional learning, right? Sometimes I think if you want to engage the community in it and get the community to buy in, maybe a little bit of plain speak can be helpful, because when you break down what social emotional learning is, it's what a lot of our SROs are doing every day in and around the schools. They're supporting healthy relationshiping, teaching those relationship skills, supporting one another, creating that culture and climate.
Yeah, and what I try to really emphasize to educators is you don't necessarily need to have a completely separate curriculum. So when you're reading a novel, how do you think this character feels? How did these two characters solve this conflict? What could they have done differently? How did this person, work through some of the challenges they were having, whether it's in a novel or it's, a news story that you hear about someone who, is more famous. It's looking at history lessons. How did these two countries that were, enemies during this war are now allies now? What did it take to get there? So there's ways that we can also integrate this very naturally into what we're doing in the classroom without a completely separate curriculum.
And model, right? It's pretty powerful when you see the SRO and the school counselor and the school psych and the administrator, and we have relationships, and this is how it goes. So.
Can you go back one slide?
Yes.
So, social emotional skill sets are real important, and we need to teach that. But if you look at the graph, there's a huge gap. And the gap is you have the teachers feeling that it's higher than the parents. So that tells me one of two things. Either the school's not communicating to the parents the difficulties their kids are having, or the parents are engaging in denial. So that's a gap that I think you can teach social skills, but I think we also need to give direct information to the parents that they can begin to listen and work at home.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when we're talking anxiety and depression, need treatment, need intervention, right? So that would definitely be something that we've got to get better communication between parent and school on. And admittedly, having been in both seats, educator and parent, it looks very different. My kid in my home is, sometimes I'm like, who are you talking about when the teachers are, explaining what my child is like in the classroom setting? So definitely an important piece to point out.
I think also just remember as well that youth today, like I was talking about earlier about the TikTok Expose Myself, they're self-diagnosing a lot on social media platforms. So there's a lot of conversations happening in the hallway. They've established a whole new terminology for when they're communicating on some of these social media platforms.
And it's not necessarily correct either. So, so there's that. We have, education is at the heart of a lot of these issues.
Yep.
Just a few things to point out in terms of mental health resources that are interesting. We asked all stakeholders what is the program that you wish your school had more of. Well, one thing that was interesting is that a lot of our participants reported that there were services in their schools. In those cases, though, they still wanted much, much more of that. So we're going to continue to see this trend of greater and greater mental health needs and resource needs. Students prioritizing actual mental health counseling. So I'm not talking about just checking in with the school counselor. There is a desire for actual counseling, mental health counseling. Parents really wanting that one-on-one counseling for their students. Educators and public safety folks prioritizing education for mental health programming, awareness, helping our stakeholders to connect with resources. One thing that came up that the next three actually are pretty exciting finds. This is about behavioral threat assessment and management. We have 2, 3, 4, 5 experts here at the table in one aspect or another of behavioral threat assessment and management, also often called BTAM. But across all stakeholders, students included, parents included, there was a lot of support for this. And this is one of those conversations that you might, hear on the news that, is not going so well. And yet here in communities from across the United States, we observed this pattern. Now, I was surprised that we have 70% of students and a little greater than 70% of parents that even know what it is and were able to indicate that they felt that it was of value to the community. No surprise, of course, that our public safety folks are going to prioritize, because public safety folks are going to have more knowledge of the proven track record of behavioral threat assessment and management, and even hands-on experience with it in the schools. So I thought that would make a lot of you very proud and happy, rightfully so.
Let me add one thing.
Sure.
One of the things we see at this point in time is, especially after the Uvalde shooting, is you'll hear people saying, we can't do anything about it, or, these things are out of control. What happens is schools don't advertise, and they can't, the success cases. Think about those of you that ask how many threat assessments you've done and how many turned into a body count. Right. Very few. There's success cases, and there's some way you could get that out to the public.
And they're happening every day.
Every day.
Yes.
Yeah.
Every day.
Very much.
So I'm going to talk about Project Unite for a second.
Go ahead.
So we have a really exciting curriculum that we've been working on with NASRO called Project Unite. Some of you may have heard a little bit about it. We'll be rolling it out this year. Right now we're still training trainers and finalizing the curriculum, but we do talk a lot about that very issue in the training. So as a matter of fact, a lot of the things that we have been talking about here today. So coming soon to be exciting. And we have, well, just after this session, we'll have a little overview of the program for those of you who are interested in it. It will be available to all of you, just like basic and advanced and all of the other awesomeness that comes from this conference. So good stuff. Speaking of school resource officers, I'm going to toggle between these two slides, SROs and SEL, similar but not similar acronyms. Again, you know, the conversation about SEL in the news and the conversations about SROs in the news might leave you feeling like, you know, there's not a lot of public support in these two areas. But what struck me as I was looking through the data here is that SROs and SEL are related pretty equally among all stakeholders, overwhelmingly as important to school safety, as valuable to school safety in their community. This scale does go up to 100. You have your kids scoring, I think, pretty high for, you know, kids who generally don't outwardly support authority figures of any kind. You certainly have public safety, educators, and parents, you know, throwing a lot of support in the direction of our school resource officers. So this is data. It is what it is. This is what people are reporting from across the country. And for it to be, you know, so closely tied into SEL in terms of the numbers, you know, our students are valuing SEL and they're valuing SROs at about that same level. So pretty exciting.
I am really excited about that because anecdotally, the things we've seen anecdotally, this absolutely aligns with it. We've seen communities that made the decision to remove SROs and parents rose up in great numbers.
Yes,
and people
especially
forgot,
in our neck of the woods.
That's right.
Yeah.
people forgot that parents are voters. Parents are part of the community
School
that
boards.
put you there to make those decisions.
Absolutely.
And this, again, aligns with parent support that we know we have in many, many communities across this country.
And I also think that that is a direct reflection of the good work that school resource officers do in terms of educating their parents as to what their roles and responsibilities are in schools. The advocacy work that school resource officers do is incredible. And I think we have to keep on doing it. And you have to talk to everybody that will listen, and even those who don't.
We must connect our SROs and our parents.
Yes.
Absolutely. It's powerful, powerful combo.
And I think, and this is an area too where school psychologists, school counselors, school social workers, and school resource officers can work together to address both physical and psychological safety. And the SEL really fits under that psychological safety piece and that partnership. And however that ends up being done in schools, they see us working together. And I think that's a powerful relationship that leads to incredible results.
It really does. So I'm going to round us out with some highlights here, and hopefully we have time for just a couple questions. I know we're coming up on our lunch hour. We unfortunately got a little bit of a late start, so bear with us. But the top 5 safety threat concerns from our stakeholders that emerged: number 1, active shooter and or attack for our students; for parents, bullying and cyberbullying; educators, mental health and mental health crises; for public safety, active shooter, and attack. So obviously a lot of other commonalities on these lists. Each and every one of them they're really a lot of the same issues, just in a slightly different order for these folks. But lots for you guys to dig into there and think about how that compares with your community. Across all stakeholders, though, the top concern, you know, with the majority of all stakeholders coming in, was active shooter and attack. So for obvious reasons that many of us are all very, very acutely aware of, you know, these tragedies continue to happen. They happen, you know, whether you are 3,000 miles away or not, you're experiencing it on some level, right? Am I right? With the news, there is that trauma impact. I was talking to somebody today who was saying, I felt guilty for being so impacted I don't know anybody in Uvalde. I didn't lose anybody, but I was devastated, and I felt guilty about that. And I think there are a lot of people who are, profoundly impacted by these things, whether they're in their community, near their community, or miles and miles away. We do need to continue, and you alluded to this a little bit, Melissa, to broaden the conversation, though, to help people to understand that these are high impact tragedies in communities. They are on the rise, but they are not as common as you might be led to believe, based on the media and based on our fear of these worst case scenarios. So I want to underscore that and then share with you top 3 priorities for schools that were shared by our stakeholders. Top priority in terms of the return to learn this coming school year for students: mental health and social emotional needs. For parents, mental health and social emotional needs came in second, only to security and campus safety, obviously wanting to make sure that that physical safety is in place there. Educators, mental health and social emotional needs, as well as public safety. So mental health is going to continue to be a dominant theme. It's ever more important that each of you, as leaders in school safety, are well-versed and attached to your community-based mental health supports and resources for your families and schools. And with that, I'm going to open us up to a question or two. Thank you for hanging with us here as we tried to speed through all the data. There's so much more to unpack on your own and in your community. But anyone who has anything that they would like to ask, now's your opportunity. I didn't do it.
James did it.
He's got the thing, the little, what's it called? Cube?
Catchbox.
There it is, Catchbox.
Everybody's ready for lunch.
Any questions?
I think they might, oh, there's one.
There's one right there.
Yes, sir. Let's see how fast James can run.
Look at him go.
Let me submit at the front.
Good morning. I know this is a national survey. Have the geographical areas been broken down as far as the individual, be it rural survey, suburban survey, and urban surveys?
Are a man after my own heart. So we have the capability to break that down because we did ask folks to identify with their area. At the moment, we don't have it in the draft. We will probably be adding a couple that break data down according to those, and we will definitely be doing that in the future. We also, in the future, will have the capability to break this down state by state. So asking in the coming year, if each of you participate and say where you are in the world, we can say, hey, look at the data here in Tennessee, or look at the data in Oregon or Colorado, and have that comparison basis. So this thing continues to grow and change and get better each and every year, but you're thinking just like we are. Thank you, sir.
And a quick follow-up, because I was really pleasantly surprised at the first slide of 68% of the students really were great about having SROs. And I think when you start breaking them down in rural, suburban, urban, I think you'll see that change. I'm really curious about that.
I'm going to get it in there for you
Thanks, Mark.
before the 19th.
Mark Bennett from Tennessee.
I got one more over here.
Hello, my name is Joshua Mercado, and first I want to thank you all for being here and giving us all this invaluable information. I am a school security officer and work closely with the SROs in Prince William County, Virginia. And the data looks solid, but my main question is, I was born mid-'80s, and my first major issue with the school shootings was Columbine,
Yeah.
the most famous one. Is there any data that can be compared to the data that's here, to any information prior to Columbine? Anything, if there's, not sure if you guys have access to that, or anything that we can compare as to how to compare before shootings became a norm, because it's also good because obviously things like this have increased exponentially.
Yeah, but if we could go back in time, and measure before school shootings became such a thing, something that is, acknowledged as an ongoing safety threat. It would be very fascinating to look at data like that. I'm not sure how. I'm going to ask our researchers here.
I could give you some from being there. I mean, as we did on analysis, there were plenty of signs that were not picked up on there were basement tapes and there were the Rampart Range tapes and all these threats and stuff like that. People weren't necessarily putting all those pieces together from that standpoint. I think that started out the whole field of threat assessment and really looking at it from a different perspective. And obviously the response, changing it from, do we set up a parameter, do we negotiate with the person to, as soon as you get there, do an entry and stuff like that. So it changed both the threat assessment model and the response model.
Really, everything, if you think about it. I mean, a lot of the work that we do here, all of us together, a lot of that has its roots in the painful lessons learned right here in Colorado in terms of, response protocols, reunification, teaching about lockdown becoming a standard procedure, threat assessment, as you said. A lot of that work that you see here has evolved and grown out of the needs that, unfortunately, really at that pivotal moment in time, really began.
Yeah,
but other things like, which are a little more yucky, how quickly can the medical examiner get the information to the parents about their children? All those things were issues.
Recovery, yeah.
I think one of the other things I would add, even prior to Columbia at Springfield, Oregon, one of the commonalities that we saw and continue to see is that leakage, that there is communication with somebody else. We're now seeing that form be in the digital form in many cases, like the Uvalde killer on an app called Yubo, but wanted to share his ideas and his thoughts. And Yubo is not a widely used app. But that concept of leakage, I think it is truly the one piece that we've continued to see time and time again.
Every time.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I just want to invite you all to look for the report at safeandsoundschools.org. You can download it. You can take the whole slide deck into your community and hopefully start some of these conversations in your community. Definitely participate with us again next year as we grow it and we dive a little bit deeper each year. We love your input, and most importantly, we just love all of you. We love what you're doing every day. We love your dedication to our kids and to keeping every community safe and sound. Have an awesome lunch.